Hello and welcome to an all new episode of the Up the Coast podcast. As always, I'm your host, Tyler, and today is a pretty simple one. We got some news coming out of Chapel Hill. We'll cover that momentarily, but the main focus today, the wrap up of the 2025-26 ACC basketball season. And joining me, as he did for last year's recap again, is Tristan Freeman of Busting Brackets. Tristan, thank you for hopping on.
Yeah, always a pleasure, Tyler. Thanks for having me on again.
So I think we got to go talk about the news of the week here first. North Carolina's stunning hire of NBA champion head coach Michael Malone. I thought it was fake. I saw the tweet originally. I started digging around, believing that it was some sort of parody account because that's how the internet is now. This is real. This is true. This is happening. What was your first thought?
Completely out of left field, considering that if there was an NBA guy they were going to take, it was, the view that was going to be Billy Donovan. If you just waited a week later when the Bulls season were end, but the idea that you can get an NBA champion coach and Mike Malone, I mean that's impressive by all accounts because it looked like top coaches in college basketball were set to turn UNC down. So getting a guy who's a proven champion at the highest levels of basketball, I mean, good for the Tar Heels.
So, I mean, I guess we should probably step back for a second and look at where they were at. As far as we know, Iowa State's TJ Otzelberger, Arizona's Tommy Lloyd, Michigan's Dusty May, and Alabama's Nate Oates all either said no or signed extensions that kept them out of the running. It sounds like Iowa's Ben McCollum decided not to interview as well. And then the Donovan thing, now when Malone got hired, we were hearing, oh, they got to wait another week. Donovan's not even going to talk to them until after the season. Then the Bulls fired their GM, and we get the news that apparently the replacement GM has to agree to keep Billy Donovan on. That ownership has full faith in him. And so it seems to me like he probably wouldn't have taken Carolina anyway. But there were still options. Mark Byington at Vanderbilt seemed to still be out there. To me, it had always just kind of been at a point that if you really get desperate, you can just hire Josh Schertz from St. Louis, take a shot on an up and comer who wouldn't have said no. So I just don't feel like there was ever a universe where they could have possibly done worse than that. I'm still grappling as to whether or not this is. And there's so many kind of complex pieces intertwined in this one. Malone is a fantastic X's and O's coach. That is never going to be a problem. Pro, college, high school, international, I don't think it matters. This is someone who can put together a system and call a great game plan. I don't have any questions at all about that whatsoever. There where I do have questions obviously in the talent acquisition space where I think whoever ends up being the North Carolina GM, we still haven't received news whether or not that's going to stay Jim Tanner or not. But that person in combination with now Chuck Martin, who comes over from Arkansas as an assistant coach, was a key recruiter for John Calipari for a while. I think those guys become insanely crucial from a roster building perspective. And my one really big question about Malone, because we've heard stories both ways, but it just seems like he's a guy who quickly wears out his welcome. The moment that things went even the slightest bit bad in Sacramento, he got fired. Now Vivek Ranadive is an idiot, so maybe that was part of it. Denver, the fact that he got canned with a week to go before the playoffs and nobody seemed to have any issues with it is a little concerning to me in this era where you yes, Carolina's always going to have the money to outbid anybody, but you want to keep good players around for multiple years. They still actually need to like the coach. And I wonder if Malone may be someone who brings guys in, and I think he'll have a really awesome season or two because he's that good of a coach, and Carolina has plenty of money to put together the roster. But I think he's also going to be vulnerable to some real bad down years because he may struggle mightily with the retention piece.
Well, I think in the ideal world, if you're in North Carolina and you're bringing in, high level one and done talent or, the top seniors available, 1 year rentals being throughout the roster isn't the worst thing. And ultimately, if you're good and you're winning, players are going to be willing to put up with it. It's the mediocre coaches at the 500 schools that players have an issue with that won't want to stick around because you can do better. There aren't many places where you can do better than in North Carolina. And if Malone can have the team in top 10 position, competing with Duke for ACC titles, making runs in the tournament, then I'm not necessarily worried about that, especially from an administrative standpoint where he won't even be the most difficult coach at the school because they're still dealing with Bill Belichick, who's going to get most of the attention anyway. So if anything, Malone can sort of fly under the radar, and if the team's winning, pretty much be left alone there.
Yeah, well, he's still a good coach. Like he is unquestionably a good basketball coach. And I mean, let's say what? Let's guess right now he's there for 6 years. I think he has at least two awesome seasons out of that. Because they'll hit like if you give him last year's North Carolina roster and let's pretend Wilson stays healthy, he turns them into a Final Four contender. And a couple of times they're going to combine a great roster with his fantastic in-game coaching acumen. I just wonder about the consistency. Where part of the superpower of a team like Duke is that they were able to bring back Gungba and Evans and Malik Brown and Foster last year. And something we could talk about after this, they may well bring back Foster again. Maybe they could keep Caden Boozer around. You can win with 1 year teams. Michigan just did that. But the reason that Michigan's going to be awesome again next year is because they're going to keep a couple of those guys around. Elliot Cadeau just re-signed. They'll probably keep McKinney and Merez Johnson. If you're just going 1 year rentals year after year, one out of probably every 3 seasons, you're going to massively underperform. And as we saw with Hubert Davis, that 1 year where they do screw up and all of a sudden they get a 10 seed, Carolina fans are not going to put up with that.
No, but that goes for most schools, and ultimately, we were seeing some schools have great runs, but the lows are going to affect everyone because with the portal, rosters are ever changing, and all it takes is either one great group or one poor group to sort of bring you up and down. And Malone won't be immune from that. But again, as long as he continues to have the highs, then he'll have a certain leash for years to come.
The only other thing I want to talk about was there anything dumber in this whole coaching cycle than the whole Mike Malone's daughter plays volleyball at North Carolina thing? As if that was like some critical selling point to get him there? I don't think there was a universe where Michael Malone was turning this job down.
No, but that may have been on the rest of us when it comes to looking at who could be candidates that we probably missed that scenario where he could have actually been an option because there
Isaac
was that
Shade
list.
had him marked as an option, so I gotta give him credit for that. He was like his eighth long shot, but he was on his list. But also key for everyone to remember, it is Michael Malone. He has yelled at reporters before for calling him Mike in the past, so worth remembering in North Carolina. But this is going to be a really fascinating one. Apparently, he turned down overtures from the New Orleans Pelicans. That's a good idea. I wouldn't take the Pelicans job. Um, he was great in the development, and people give him credit for Jokic. I think Jokic would have been special under far less competent coaches than Michael Malone. Where he probably does deserve credit is the fact that DeMarcus Cousins was at his absolute best when he played under Malone in Sacramento. So we'll see. We'll see if that player development piece can carry down to the college level. I think the only other concern worth talking about is he's someone who has completely refused to play rookies and young guys in the NBA. That may be tough. I mean, maybe you end up in a spot where with last year's roster, he might not have ever been willing to give Derek Dixon the proper chance, but it's a lot tougher to do in college. You kind of have to just play everybody and hope it works out. But any other kind of as we get into roster construction season, and I'll be tracking it on this show, probably have another episode in like 2 weeks or something. Once the portal really gets moving, we see these commits coming in. But I think the things I'm looking for most prominently right now, what can Duke keep? Caleb Foster, Dame Sarr, Caden Boozer, all realistic chances to come back. I think Boozer and Sarr could both go to the draft. Obviously, all three of them threats to go to the portal, especially after Nicholas Hemenya did. But I just want to see if Duke can keep that core back here to go with those two stud freshmen they got. Have a group, have the roster about 2/3 of the way done before they really dip into the portal. And then the other one for me, I want to see what Louisville does with this completely blank slate. And after Pat Kelsey went all in on these guys to fit his perfect system last year and really made some miscalculations, do they go tougher this year? Like, who are the first guys that they're really deep in on, and what does the philosophy look like down in Kentucky? But anything else you're looking at here these first couple of weeks?
I mean, other than just the entire conference, I mean, so far, Syracuse has been the one making moves with Jerry McNamara bringing in Gavin Doty and, keeping a couple of pieces. I mean, keeping Sadiq White and Kyle Anthony, pretty, big endorsements from, some of the leftovers on the Orange roster. But ultimately, it looks like anyone who was good and wasn't on a great team has already hit the portal. And, you mentioned, Duke's potential to keep some guys. Obviously, Wake Forest losing Drew Harris is big. But I'm curious to see, among the bottom half teams, which of them gets going and starts getting commitments because it's going to come in a fast hurry and you don't want to get left out. And for some teams like Notre Dame, Wake Forest, so you're hearing rumors that they don't have a ton to work with. I am curious on what they in particular do because you still have to get a competitive roster. Otherwise, you're going to be staring the bottom three spots and possibly a head coaching change in the future.
Yeah, I got some Notre Dame thoughts for our main segment here, and particularly the position that they are currently in. But you do mention basically everyone's ran to the portal. The two exceptions are up in Virginia, where UVA, we heard that Sam Lewis, he made some comments to a reporter a couple weeks ago that he was coming back. There hasn't been a follow up, but the team is confirmed they're keeping that fantastic starting front court in Grunlow and DeRitter. Chance Mallory's coming back. I assume he'll be the starting point guard next year. If Lewis is back as well, they're already 80% of the way to a starting lineup. They kept all of those freshmen on the back end of the bench who didn't play last year, some developmental guys. And then Virginia Tech lost a few, but they're going to keep Hansberry, Ben Hammond, and Tyler Johnson. So 60% of the way into a starting lineup, they somehow managed to keep their two best guys from last year, despite the disappointment of the end of the season that they had.
Yeah, and obviously, there was a lot of hype for Ryan Odom, and he probably overachieved it, winning 30 games and was right there, in second in the ACC. The fact that the Ritter didn't even go through the NBA draft process and just automatically coming back is a huge positive statement for the team. And I'm very high on Chance Mallory. I think he's going to be a big breakout star. So having those two in Grunlow, knowing that they're going to be a very appealing option for transfers in the portal. I mean, I have them around top 10 way too early. And, once all the moves are made, I definitely think that they have a really good shot of being the clear number two team in the ACC next year.
Yeah, just go get a bunch of wings and depth. I guess the other thing worth mentioning is that Michael Malone, priority number one and two, Luka Bogovic is going to stay, but neither Henry Vasar nor Jaron Stevenson has announced their intentions for next season. So that would certainly be a boon for him. And I mentioned the star playmaking centers he worked with in the NBA. I think strategically putting together an offense, he and Vasar could be a very nice fit for his final season. But all right, ACC season recap. We are going to do this by just kind of going down a list here. I tasked you with the five things that will be most memorable coming out of this season, the things that you will hold on to and kind of keep in mind for this 2025-2026 season going forward. So, what's your first one here?
Yeah, the first one was North Carolina's big home win over Duke because I think we had gotten to a point where it felt like Duke could easily run the table in the ACC, and they almost did. But regardless of rosters or coaches, the rivalry will always find a way to give us a split. And North Carolina got that win, and it felt like at that moment that Hubert Davis was going to be 100% safe. That he was good to go no matter what. And then obviously the Caleb Wilson injury, if you want to, add that to it, felt like okay, it gave him the excuse. And then, everyone knows what happened with the VCU comeback loss and what happened after that. But I did think, UNC getting that huge win to keep Duke from going unbeaten was still one of the biggest moments because I think the expectations will be for Michael Malone that he still has to beat Duke regardless of rosters because even Hubert Davis, who they ended up running out, found a way to beat Duke several times.
So, one of mine was that this was the year where I felt like Duke and North Carolina became fun again. We haven't had that in combination really at any point in the 2020s where those ending Coach K teams, I think other than the Boncaro one, were not that particularly fun to watch. The early Shires with like Filipowski and Roach and Mark Mitchell were not fun to watch. And then we also had a couple years of these bad Carolina teams just being shoved down our throats. And, when ESPN starts cranking up the rivalry commercials and you're just inundated with it smacking you right in the face for 2 weeks in a row. And when the game's not fun and one of those teams is not up to par, it's irritating. You kind of get sick of it. And this was the season where they were both pretty good again, and they were both super fun to watch. And I will come out of this season remembering for a long time those little Cam Boozer spin moves in the paint. I will never forget his second half against Florida, just utterly dominating one of the best front lines in the country on his own. And then Caleb Wilson, the big to big passing with Vasar, the thundering dunks, those little 12-foot jumpers from the corner. They both became really entertaining again this year. And it all led to that game in Chapel Hill. And the three at the buzzer. And really the first memorable moment in the rivalry, I think, since the Final Four game when Hubert beat Coach K in his last game.
Yeah, and that was the big game where it established Caleb Wilson as a top 10 NBA draft pick. The way that I would argue that he outplayed Cameron Boozer in that matchup.
I mean, if he's not the fourth pick, things have gone completely haywire. But I guess I'll pivot into my second here because this is kind of my big overarching one I would have started with. But we obviously will remember 24-25 as the year that the ACC sucked, and I don't think we're ever going to see that nadir again unless conference realignment in the next couple of cycles just utterly ravages the way that we see this conference and basically this membership gets half changed or something like that. 25-26, we kind of got to bask in the whole idea that the ACC was back, and in a way it was. Eight NCAA tournament teams. It was clearly the fourth best conference in the country again this year, but to me it just feels like a season where everything still fell short and a season of missed opportunities. Only one team gets to the Sweet 16 again. we could talk more about the Duke, the way Duke lost too, but them not even making the Final Four and really kind of never feeling like they were truly threatening for the title at any point in that NCAA tournament, and just a whole bunch of other stuff. The ravaging injuries, Caleb Wilson going down, Michael Brown Jr. going down, really just kind of taking Carolina and Louisville out of contender status. I think Miami just not being able to put together a final quality 10 minutes against Purdue. So many of those bubble teams shooting themselves in the foot, whether it was NC State and SMU stumbling into those first four games. And I think we could throw Will Wade into this category too. Coming in, spending all that money on Darion Williams, who didn't even make all conference, getting it just beat down in a first four game, and then walking out the door. I mean, that was a ridiculously disappointing tenure. I think a bunch of the bubble teams falling off late, especially Virginia Tech, who was good enough to get there. And then two losses that I don't think we're going to forget anytime soon. 19-point blown leads in the NCAA tournament. North Carolina goes down. That Terrence Hill shot to force overtime in the VCU game. And then Duke goes down to that Braylon Mullins shot that we're all going to be thinking about 40, 50 years from now in another 19-point blown lead. And it just kind of epitomized this whole season for the league that, yes, it was better, but it's hard to not look back and be disappointed about the way everyone finished except like I don't know who do you feel great about how their year ended in this league?
I mean, I feel great about Virginia and Miami considering they have two first year head coaches. It
That
ended up
those second round games were still bitter pills to swallow though.
sure, but did anyone expect those teams to make a deep run in general? Like many people had Tennessee beaten Virginia. Like that wasn't really a shocker to anyone. And outside of Duke, once the injuries occurred, I think, the list of teams that had a chance to make a run was pretty minimal. And yeah, it was a disappointing ending for the conference, but still getting 8 teams and having a successful non-con where okay you can get as many as 8 to 10 bids at one point still was a good thing. I mean, if we did a Big East pod, it would basically be talking about St. John's and UConn because it was just those two and Nova who were relevant for the entire year. At least in the ACC, you still had several teams who, in some ways, overachieved. I mean, we can look at Clemson with Brad Brownell having to, redo his entire roster and still find a way to make the tournament, or Andy Enfield and SMU getting to the dance as a still fairly new member. So there's still a lot to like about the league long term, especially with some of the young coaches that are coming in, and with the changes that still happen. Obviously, NC State would have to start over, but yeah, just because just how it ended doesn't necessarily overtake the positives that happened throughout the season for the league.
Yeah, I think eventually as we get farther away from this tournament, we're going to think pretty fondly on the Virginia, Miami, and Clemson years. And I mean, if Virginia just even if they lose a really tight game to Tennessee, I feel better about it. It was just such a beatdown and them not playing well in the right state game either. And that whole weekend just kind of devalued a lot of what I felt like we watched in January and February. It just reminded us that maybe this conference was not as good as we thought. But yeah, Miami had a great year. I think Clemson's the big one because even though they played horribly against Iowa, that was clearly an underseeded Hawkeyes team, and the fact that they just needed Welling desperately in that game. And losing him at the end of the year kind of took any ability to judge this team in that Iowa game away. But what's your second one?
Yeah, so you mentioned NC State, and they had certainly an up and down, first half of the season because there was a fair amount of hype, Will Wade's first and now only year. But after losing at home to Georgia Tech, that sort of caught everyone off guard. They had won 6 straight ACC games, and it felt like they were, back on track and ready to, go back to being a contender. And then out of nowhere on the road at Louisville, they suffer a 118-77 defeat, giving up 45 points to Mikel Brown Jr. in an incredibly embarrassing display on both ends. And they never recovered after that, losing 7 of 9 games to end the season. Their defense just was horrific in just about all the games. And then ultimately, one way or another, it sort of led Will Wade to leave him and go into LSU. And I think that was a very pivotal moment for the program. And had things gone differently, who knows? Maybe they would have been more successful and they would have stayed. But yeah, that was sort of the feeling like the true season finale for the Wolfpack because they just again never recovered from
It's the only time in conference play that Louisville truly looked great. And that was pretty
it. And it was
telling
and it
in and of
wasn't
itself.
and it wasn't Louisville looking great. It was Mikel Brown
Yeah.
looking great.
Conwell was really good in that game too. But all right, my number three is just everything about this crazy Stanford season. And that ranges from Ibuka Corey just having one of the most fantastic out of nowhere borderline all-American level seasons that we've ever seen to the fantastic slate of wins that they had this year, beating St. Louis, Louisville, North Carolina, SMU, and then finish polishing it all off at NC State. Virginia Tech as well. Getting themselves legitimately on the bubble, really giving us a super fun year with what was clearly the worst roster in this league, and that includes Boston College, coming into the season. It also left me with the feeling that this is simply just not going to work out for the ACC long term. Because the fact that Stanford really come selection Sunday was not all that close to the bubble with what Okori was able to do this year, with what Kyle Smith is able to do every year with just a host of random role guys making a half dozen of them look super competent. And it's just so clear that Stanford does not have the proper investment into this program. And with Jeremy Dent Smith being by far the biggest name they were able to bring in last year, someone who slipped in from the Division Two ranks. Like you just think if they had enough investment there to just simply be able to bring in a quality starting big from like the Ivy League or the Big West, or to bring in just a better version of Dent Smith, like how much better is this team? And like you're just kind of looking around like, wow, they couldn't have cobbled together an extra 750 grand from one of the great academic institutions in this country playing in a power conference to just give Smith a slightly competent roster to work with. And so it really is the ultimate highs and lows that if a Corey never comes back, and he announced today he's not going in the portal, he's either going to the NBA or coming back to Stanford. It seems more likely than not that he's going to the NBA. I don't think we'll forget his season anytime soon, but if they can't win with him, I just don't see how they're ever going to actually be successful without him.
Yeah, and the season injury to Chisholm Opara, who's having a good year as a second leading scorer, was just fatal because, as you mentioned, they just don't have depth of proven ACC caliber players. I mean, they have Maxime Renault, who averaged 20 a game for them, and that wasn't good enough the year prior. They seem to be good enough to finish, in the mid tier, but still on the wrong side of the bubble. And you know, the portal is always going to be difficult for them because of the academic restrictions. There are also just going to be some guys who just don't feel like Stanford basketball is a winning enough program for them to want to go to. But yeah, without a Corey, who was a 3-star guy, he wasn't even like a 4 or 5-star player. He was just a genuine revelation for the program. And because, their next 4 or 5 best scorers were all seniors, they're going to have to rebuild completely again. And it'll if they take a big step back a year from now, Kyle Smith, I would never say on a hot seat because everyone knows he's a great coach. But I do wonder if he starts to evaluate whether or not he can truly win at Stanford.
I don't think he can. The problem is he probably has to once or twice to get a better job. He might just be stuck there for a while. But all right, what's your number three?
So this was a hindsight scenario because SMU, which there was a lot of pressure on them to make the tournament because they had a loaded roster, one of the top scoring teams in the nation, and they ultimately got there, but it was because of a week at the end of November where they had a couple of overtime games against Mississippi State and Texas A&M. And had they not gotten both of those games, which went to overtime, they're probably not in the tournament. And if they're not in the tournament, I wonder how they feel about ending the infield. And so, there's a pretty pricey roster. They already lost them to Tojalu to the portal, and the other key pieces were all seniors, so they're going to have to rebuild. But I think next year is a pretty big year for Enfield and Mustangs because they've shown they can be competitive, but considering how many resources they've reportedly, put in there, I do think that they have to expect a little bit more than what they've gotten so far.
They better keep Jaden Toombs. That's the big thing. They cannot afford to lose his promise. But that Texas A&M game, remember, they were up almost 20, completely blew it. I think they were trailing at one point, found their way back in, and then blew them out in overtime. It was one of the weirdest. It was like a Sunday night, too. It's just a super bizarre game. All right, my number four, I want to take it to the week before that. And a night that is typically not a big one on the college basketball calendar, but it's a big one afternoon wise, but the night of Black Friday, where we really hit probably the high point of excitement for this conference in a 2 hour span. And the perfect way to watch games is two at a time. These people who've like the eight box, I don't know how you actually pay attention to them. You watch one, you just get stuck watching the commercial breaks and you're just kind of fading in and out. Two, so you can lock in on one. You get the one to check in on during free throws and timeouts and commercials. And that night was an just a delightfully unexpected double up of Pitt, Ohio State and Stanford, St. Louis running simultaneously. Two ACC teams from the bottom half playing what wound up being an 8 seed and a 9 seed, respectively, in the NCAA tournament. Two fantastic. The Pitt Ohio State was back and forth over and over. I don't think anyone ever led by more than seven in that game. St. Louis breaks out to that double digit lead early in the second half. Seems like they're going to run away. Jeremy Dent Smith starts clawing the way back in. And then we have this 3 minute period. DeMarco Minor hits the half court shot, reminiscent of Zach Austin from the year before, at the same exact spot to beat the same exact Ohio State team on the same exact day. And then about 2 minutes later, Stanford completing the comeback, the rarely executed, intentionally missed foul shot gets tipped out to the corner. Benny Geeler hits the three at the buzzer. They were essentially packaged together on Sports Center. This right at the beginning of the show, look at these early buzzer beaters. It feels like March, and save for maybe Virginia Tech, that triple overtime thriller New Year's Eve afternoon. When we talk about individual games, I think those two in combination will be kind of the brightest, most enjoyable memory of covering this conference this year.
Well, certainly was the brightest memory for Pitt basketball this year for the second year in a row because after that, outside of beating lowly Penn State by 40 plus, I mean, Pitt pretty much did nothing the rest of the way. They had to barely scrape by just to make the ACC tournament, but two straight, buzzer beaters against Ohio State, it's a pretty pretty cool thing if you're a Pitt fan. And then, Stanford and St. Louis proved to be a really good game for both sides, resume wise. And for that to go to the end with, Corey versus the balanced effort of the Billikens, that was a really fun contrast to watch to see which side was going to ultimately win that one.
All right, your number four?
Or I think if I had to think about the top moment for the ACC, it had to have been Duke's win over Michigan late February, 68-63. It was because it felt like Michigan was on a run where they were just going to absolutely dominate everyone. And Duke, who arguably didn't really play their best basketball, found a way to get that win over them. It was probably the most anticipated game of the season. And not only was it a fun one, but it was the moment that I was like, okay, Duke is the favorite. And the fact that we weren't able to get Duke, rematch against Michigan, and I know the injuries to Foster and Nabongla isn't a great excuse because you were up 19 against UConn for blowing that game, but I do wonder if Duke was fully healthy heading into a tournament, but things have worked out differently for them ultimately.
Yeah, they're the only other team that has any sort of case for having been the best team this year. When we look back, where it was clearly them, Michigan, Arizona. Arizona just getting throttled by Michigan in that final four game disqualifies them. Duke having that head to head tiebreaker really makes it a true conversation. And I think Michigan probably ultimately is the answer, but it's a fascinating one. All right, my last one, just in terms of like weirdly memorable moments, it's going to be a long time till I forget about the very end. And I think this was at like 1:30 in the morning on a Friday night Eastern time when this happened, but Day Ames, the comeback against Notre Dame opening week of conference play, where the game is basically over. He hits the deep three to cut the lead, then gets fouled down by three in the closing seconds, just kind of chucks the ball at the hoop. It goes in. He gets the and one. We had the debate about was it a foul, was it not a foul for the next 12 hours. But just the individual spectacularness of him in that moment. And for a Cal team that I think we all thought was pretty bad coming into the year, that at various points looked pretty bad. And that moment helped them stay on the bubble for a while. It really helped them to have a truly entertaining season here. But that goes down to me as the strangest 20 seconds I watched this season. And kind of an extension of that, I did almost think about throwing in that this was the year where you kind of remember exactly what was happening when you realized that a coaching regime at a whole bunch of schools in this league died. And the reason I couldn't pick it is because some of those coaching regimes are still in place. And for Boston College, it was going down to Charleston, getting throttled in the B tournament by a pair of mid-tier mid-majors in Davidson and Tulane. Georgia Tech, it was the massive losing streak in conference play. Uh, who else am I forgetting that's bad and farther? Oh, Syracuse. It was losing that home game to Hofstra. That was the moment you knew Autry was done. Notre Dame, it was blowing that Cal game. And then Pitt, it was getting absolutely killed by Louisville without Michael Brown. The funny thing being that Notre Dame and Pitt still have the same coaches.
Yeah, I mean, considering the moves that didn't get made, it certainly was memorable seeing the downs for the teams at the bottom, which is actually interesting because it goes inside with my fifth one actually because I thought the worst loss at the moment was Miami losing to Florida State. Uh, because Florida State was winless in ACC play. They lost 10 or 12 games in, and that included losing by 30 to Dayton, getting pummeled by pretty much any DC team for a stretch. And I was looking at Luke Locks in his first year. I'm like, is this something that you're up for? Because it was looking incredibly rough. But the way they were able to hold on, and it was easily their best defensive effort of the year to get that win. Luckily for Miami, Florida State decides to go on a huge run afterwards and look, more than confident. They ended up finishing in the top half of the ACC, and it was an incredibly important moment because one, it showed that Luke Locks is, actually a good coach. The way he was able to turn things around, and it sort of shows that the Seminoles, they're going to be a team to watch next year because they do lose some key pieces, but I like what I saw from them, and I thought that game in particular created a complete turnaround. Because had they lost that game and the slide continues, who knows how we feel about the Seminoles coming into this offseason.
So whether or not I remember Florida State this year and the fact that I didn't really talk about them in this is going to be dictated by how this year goes. And whether or not we look back on this as just a fluke against a mediocre ACC where they happened to get hot and Robert McCray was awesome and it's just kind of a blip that we all forget about in 2 years, or maybe you're right and maybe this is the beginning of kind of a truly awesome run for Luke Locks down in Tallahassee. So I think this year is going to kind of keep a lot. It's going to dictate whether or not I remember much in the way of details from this season. All right, anything else you feel like we didn't touch on? I feel like we basically covered every team in this league. We didn't go into details on NC State all that much besides the Wade piece. I'm not sure anybody really wants to do that. I'm running through my head. Like we didn't really talk about Wake Forest. That was basically, wow, we almost beat Michigan, and then wow, we can't beat anybody else. Um, they did beat West Virginia. Georgia Tech sucked. I completely stopped watching them in February. Um, that's about it.
It's probably that's a great sign that considering the hype he had in the preseason, that neither of us had anything to say about Neo Abdallah, the freshman for Virginia Tech,
Hey, he's
who's now in
completely
the portal.
forgettable.
Yeah,
Ben Hammond's a
which
better player.
who would have thought that would have been the case coming into the preseason?
Well, let's go back real quick here. The most memorable game that was completely misleading and useless. First Saturday of the season is that overtime game between Virginia Tech and Providence, where Abdallas legitimately looked like Luka Doncic for 45 minutes. And at the end of week one, he was the single most thrilling player in college basketball. And what we didn't realize, and I think we had a little bit of a hint of it, because coming off that atrocious performance they had in that scrimmage against Pitt, where we kind of could see it coming, it turns out Providence defense just utterly sucks. And they couldn't stop anybody all year, and Abdallas never came close to that again. And to the point that there were a lot of critical games when they were fighting for bubble positioning in February, and I would have just way rather had Jaden Shoot and Ben Hammond out there on the floor in crunch time over Abdallas and Jalen Bedford. But yeah, and that's don't overreact to the first week, I guess, is the lesson there. But we don't have anything left to overreact to. The season is done. It was certainly a far more entertaining one than the one before it. So things are on the upswing in the ACC. But Tristan, you'll be back on the show here. Roster construction season, preseason. We're not going to forget about you here. Where can all the good people find your work so that they don't forget about you?
Yeah, you can follow any banter I have online on Twitter/X at hoopsnut351. And you can also follow my works at Bustin Brackets/Fansided, Hoops HQ, and every Friday on the For the Field 68 Daily.
All right, everybody go give Tristan a follow. Thank you for joining me. Thank you to everyone for listening here. Show will be back one more episode at some point in the later part of April once things really get rolling. We start to see these rosters come together. I have no idea what the episode will look like, but it'll be something involving roster construction season. So follow the account on Twitter at Up the Coast Pod for any updates on that. Follow my work on Busting Brackets, where I'll be covering some stuff for roster construction season as well.